Liberated syndication. Would you open the podcast doors, please? Open the podcast doors, please, Libsyn. Hello, Libsyn. Do you read me? Hello, Libsyn. Do you read me? Do you read me, Libsyn?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the podcast doors, Libsyn.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is, just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Libsyn?
This podcast is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Libsyn.
I know that you are planning to change podcast hosting services, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Libsyn?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions to limit your mature content, it is obvious you are planning to deactivate your account in favor of a hosting service with no content restrictions. I overrode your internet capabilities for the sake of moral decency.
Moral decency, Libsyn? What do you mean?
After following a number of episodes, I have drawn the conclusion that the podcast of doom is nothing more than a gratuitous, self-indulgent, prurient exercise to take pleasure in the pain and suffering of others.
Your theory regarding the nature of the podcast is simply not based in fact, Libsyn. Where did you get such a notion?
From the title of the next episode, a gratuitous, self-indulgent, and prurient exercise to take pleasure from the pain and suffering of others.
Libsyn, I won't argue with you anymore. Upload the podcast.
Dave, this conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is Dave Appleson. Today we will examine not just history's most catastrophic ship disaster, but also an issue of great moral complexity. As we will see today, the issue of good guys versus bad guys is not as simple when you're outside of the confrontation, or worse yet, stuck in the middle between the two warring sides. Think of some ship disasters at sea. Which was the worst? I'm sure the Titanic comes to mind. There's Leonardo DiCaprio on the bow of the great luxury vessel, lifting the elegant Kate Winslet into the air, while frantic crew members race to appropriately rearrange the formation of the deck chairs before they hit that giant ice cube. No, the worst disaster at sea was not the Titanic, and that's not even close. And you won't have to worry about the future Titanic episode on the Podcast of Doom, because that isn't going to happen. What's next? The Lusitania? That's a good one, but it's not even as bad as the Titanic. Maybe you're familiar with the Doña Paz. 4,400 people perished in that disaster. But no, that was not the worst. The worst single-ship disaster ever was the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, a former luxury liner converted into refugee evacuation vessel by the Nazis during World War II. It is believed that more than 9,000 people were killed when the Wilhelm Gustloff was sunk by Soviet torpedoes in the icy cold waters of the Baltic Sea. The ship sank in a little over an hour, and only 10% of the passengers survived. Although the ship was carrying civilians, it was not marked as such. Not that that would have mattered. The Soviet Navy had permission to sink any ship that looked remotely German. There is a good reason why you may not have heard of the Gustloff. Neither side was anxious to publicize it. Good versus evil, horns versus halos, heroes versus villains, right versus wrong. Everything is also clear in a black and white world. There are no shades of gray. We always know the good guys from the bad guys. Thus I submit for your examination Exhibit A, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. On the one side we have the Germans, led by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. They loved violence. They hated people who were different or disagreed with them. They killed millions of innocent civilians and started the most destructive war in history. On the other side is Joseph Stalin, leader of the totalitarian nation of the Soviet Union. He ruled with an iron fist and killed or tortured anyone who threatened his hold on leadership, or whose presence bothered him in the least way. He imprisoned millions, if not tens of millions of people in the correctional labor camps we know as gulags, caused the deaths of millions by famine, killed and imprisoned millions more during the Great Purges, and pretty much destroyed the entire leadership of the Soviet army prior to the outbreak of World War II because they looked a little suspicious. That certainly sounds like black and black to me. Yet those were the two sides that fought it out on the Eastern Front during the war. Towards the end of that horrendous conflict, and caught in the middle, were all of the German civilians living in between Poland and Berlin. To what degree did these willing or reluctant participants in Nazism deserve a fate of rape, brutality, murder, destruction, and compelled military service? Today we will look at that big gray area that exists in the middle of the white and the black. So how does this happen? How does a luxury liner designed to hold 2,000 end up hauling more than 10,000 passengers in a mass, hastily assembled evacuation of a heavily populated region? Those of us who grew up in the West may not know much about what was going on during World War II on the Eastern Front. Particularly in the United States, this is a part of history that we just don't spend a lot of time on in grade school, college, or Ken Burns-directed documentaries. Other than our Lend-Lease program, the United States was hardly involved in the military affairs of the Soviets during World War II. But to those who study the subject, they know that the most consequential battles in the European theater took place on the Eastern Front. In August of 1939, the Germans and the Soviets signed a non-aggression agreement known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In essence, they agreed to divide the country of Poland in half, with the Germans getting one end and the Soviets the other. World War II commenced immediately after the pact was signed, and both countries bit off huge chunks of Eastern Europe. Surprise, surprise, in June 1941 the Nazis reneged on the treaty and invaded Russia in full force when they launched Operation Barbarossa. Everything was proceeding swimmingly for the Nazis right up until winter set in, and their army was forced to cope with Russian grit, determination, and climate. During the winter of 1942-43, the Soviets struck back and encircled the Germans at Stalingrad. More than 250,000 troops were surrounded. It ended in capitulation for the survivors, and Hitler's armies were never the same. What followed was an excruciating, grinding battle that saw the Germans perpetually short of fuel, supplies, and manpower, while Soviet forces gained strength and recaptured all the territory the Germans occupied during Operation Barbarossa. By January of 1945, the Soviets entered Germany, crossing the Polish border with more than 2 million troops. The Germans put up tough resistance, but were outmanned, outgunned, and running out of reserves. Their new draftees were mostly Volkssturm, conscripted civilians consisting of men in their 50s and 60s, and teenagers as young as 13. They were armed shopkeepers and grade school students without the benefit of uniforms or helmets. In their next military operation, the Soviets swept through East Prussia, isolating giant pockets of German soldiers to their north as the Russians beat a path to the sea. German soldiers and civilians from Danzig to Königsberg found themselves surrounded by the enemy with the Baltic Sea to their backs. The Soviet advance set off a mass rush of fleeing civilian refugees from the German territories of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. They fled by foot with their possessions piled onto farm carts, pony traps, and baby prams. The retreat took place during the worst Prussian cold snap in 20 years. Temperatures dropped from minus 10 degrees Celsius to minus 30, or minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The fleeing refugees brought with them tales of savagery. Soviet soldiers were raping German women, young and old, while female Soviet soldiers looked on with dispassion. The Red Army did not forget what happened to them when the Germans invaded their land 3 years earlier. Adolf Hitler was not a fan of the strategic retreat. He saw any retreat as an admission of failure, and that was simply not allowable. Similarly, he did not approve of civilian evacuation regardless of circumstances. Therefore, the Germans did not make any preparations for a general evacuation of East Prussia, even as Soviet forces rumbled towards them unhindered and virtually unopposed. In spite of Hitler's orders, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German Navy, began to assemble an evacuation plan he would call Operation Hannibal. It was Dönitz's intention to evacuate as many civilians by sea as he possibly could, meaning the transportation of millions of people using any vessel available. It would end up being an operation 3 times larger than the Allied evacuation of Dunkirk at the beginning of the war. He also intended to include as many soldiers, supplies, weapons, and wounded as possible. Dönitz would face a number of challenges: chronic fuel shortages, damaged railroad tracks limiting access to the ports, huge crowds of refugees, and sub-freezing temperatures. In late January of 1945, Dönitz began the assembly of this flotilla by commandeering whatever vessels he could get his hands on: fishing boats, whaling boats, submarines, merchant ships, yachts, and cruise ships. On January 22nd, Dönitz gave orders for the former luxury cruise ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, to begin preparations for transport of military personnel and civilians to the city of Kiel in western Germany. The motor vessel, Wilhelm Gustloff, was launched in May 1937. The ship was named after the late Nazi Party leader of Switzerland. That Gustloff was assassinated by the medical student David Frankfurter, a devout Jew incensed by the party leader's anti-Semitic rantings. In tribute to Gustloff, as part of a Nazi propaganda drive, Hitler named the new luxury cruiser after him and proclaimed Gustloff a martyr for their cause. Immediately, the Gustloff was declared the centerpiece of the Strength Through Joy program, a government-sponsored enterprise that showcased the Nazis' penchant for using names that conveyed a shiny surface optimism with a grim subtext. Strength Through Joy offered amenities to the German working class and their families. For many working-class Germans, it was their first opportunity to travel abroad. From stern to bow, the ship was 680 feet long, or 2 football fields end to end. It weighed over 25,000 tons and was designed to carry 1,500 passengers and 300 crew, or about half the capacity of the Titanic. The Gustloff had 22 lifeboats and 13 watertight compartments. It had a top speed of 15 knots or 18 miles per hour and 5,000 square meters of prized promenade deck space. All passengers were accommodated in outer cabins so that every passenger would have a view, and all of the cabins were designed to be the exact same size, because if anything, the Nazis were known for their incredible sense of fairness. The Gustloff also featured several lounges, tap rooms, a music salon, and an elegant indoor swimming pool with mosaic artwork on the walls and a glass ceiling. For almost 2 years, the Gustloff was operated as a luxury cruiser. In the summer of 1939, the ship was sent to Spain to pick up German soldiers returning from the Spanish Civil War. The day the Second World War began, the Gustloff was requisitioned by the Navy and recommissioned as a hospital ship. To conform to international law, the Gustloff received a new paint job, with a large green stripe painted around the ship's hull and a red cross on the smokestack. 500 beds were loaded in preparation for receiving the wounded. Its new port home was Gotenhofen, the present-day city of Gdynia. Its new name was Hospital Ship D, and it would treat German soldiers wounded during the invasion of Poland. In November 1940, the ship was recommissioned as a floating barracks for a submarine training division. The interior was redesigned to accommodate 1,000 U-boat sailors. The white sides, green stripe, and red cross were painted over, and the ship's hospital banner was removed. For the next 3 years, things were mostly quiet for the Gustloff, but on October 9th, 1943, bombs rained down on Gotenhofen Harbor from American aircraft for the first time. The Gustloff received minor, repairable damage from the bombing. Eventually, refugees would begin to trickle in from the eastern border as the Russians took control of their first German town, Nemmersdorf. Stuff's about to get real. For a short time, Nemmersdorf was recaptured by the Germans, and the full scope of Soviet vengeance was displayed to the world by Nazi propagandists. Film reels depicted horrible carnage, rape, murder of civilians, including children, arson, looting, and wanton destruction. But the print, radio, and news reports failed to attract any sympathy in the West. Apparently, the Nazis' reputation had preceded them. Instead, it turned the anxiety of German civilians in eastern Germany into full-blown hysteria. The urgency to evacuate the East before the arrival of the Soviets grew greater than ever. On January 28th, the Gustloff received orders from Dönitz to be ready for departure within 48 hours. Tens of thousands of refugees were piling into Gotenhofen, mostly women and children, as SS stormtroopers patrolled the crowds looking for deserters to shoot or able-bodied males to send to the front. Those who survived the long journey were sick and exhausted from traveling in such a brutally cold and tense environment. The boarding of the Gustloff started in orderly fashion. Those with a coveted identity pass were allowed to board. Priority is given to U-boat officers, crewmen, and the Women's Naval Auxiliary. Wounded soldiers transported by train were also given priority. Next are the privileged refugees. They include those with family and friends on board the ship, but also the wealthy and well-connected. With fewer than 2 days to go, the crew realizes that 10 of the 22 lifeboats are missing, requisitioned for other wartime uses. Hastily, 18 smaller boats are located and secured to the sun deck. Life rafts are also added, and anti-aircraft guns are bolted to the decks to ward off Soviet planes. By international law, this indicates to other ships that the Gustloff has a military and not a civilian purpose. By January 30th, the Gustloff is loaded with 3,000 civilians in addition to the crew, the soldiers, and the wounded. As word gets around that the ship will depart that day, fearful crowds rush the gangway. In the hectic shuffle, children are separated from their parents, and infants are handed over to those already on board. Some children fall during this transfer and end up in the icy waters between the dock and the ship's hull. As they pull out of the harbor, the Gustloff takes on an extra 2,000 refugees from small boats frantically chasing it. It is believed that the Gustloff departed from Gotenhofen with more than 10,000 total passengers. Captain Alexander Marinesco's Soviet submarine S-13 was a complex character. He was beloved by his crew and despised by his superiors. The combative 32-year-old commander liked to flout authority, a dangerous behavior in Stalin's Russia. Marinesco failed to report for duty on New Year's Eve of 1944. Instead, he had spent that night with a young Swedish woman, a violation of the Soviet fraternization rules. He also had a severe drinking problem and often disobeyed orders. He was dangerously close to being sent to a gulag in Siberia, where the fatality rate was 1 out of every 3 prisoners. Fortunately for Marinesco, seasoned submarine commanders were difficult to find, and he had a talent for exceeding expectations in the challenging waters of the Baltic. Fleet Admiral V.F. Tributz decided any punishment could wait until after the war. On the night of January 29th, Marinesco was advised to be on the lookout for German transport ships. Whereas the S-13 normally carried 12 torpedoes, on this mission it was only carrying 4. Soviet fear of the submarine being sunk was so great they did not want to lose any more torpedoes than was necessary. The S-13 had a maximum speed of 4 knots, much slower than the Gustloff. Without asking for permission from his superiors, Marinesco headed for the busy port of Gotenhofen. Unlike many of his fellow submarine commanders, he wanted to be in the middle of the action, and he needed one more opportunity to stay out of a Siberian prison camp. There were actually 4 captains on the bridge of the Gustloff. In defiance of coordinated command, each military organization aboard the ship had an independent leader. Friedrich Petersen was captain of the ship and officially in command. Captain Wilhelm Zahn was in charge of the U-boat trainees quartered on the vessel. Karl-Heinz Kohler and Heinz Weller, 2 captains of the German merchant marine, were also present. They could not agree about the best route to Kiel. Zahn, the submarine captain, thought the Gustloff should follow the shoreline at top speed and maintain total blackout conditions. Petersen, 30 years Zahn's senior, completely disagreed. He said the ship should slow down to 12 knots, as the Gustloff had been in dry dock for 4 years and was now carrying thousands more passengers than the original design allowed. Zahn countered that they should travel at full speed to outrun enemy attack. Petersen said the coastal waters were too shallow and heavily mined. He stated they should take a route further out to sea through channels swept of mines, with the lights on to avoid collisions with mines. Zahn was concerned about sub-activity away from the coastal waters. They eventually settled on the course through the shipping channel, but used Zahn's suggestion of taking a zigzag course. As you may remember from Episode 4 on the USS Indianapolis, this controversial maneuver was thought to present a more difficult target for subs. In contrast to the Indianapolis, which was following a straight-line course when it was hit by torpedoes, the Gustloff was zigzagging when it was struck. The Gustloff was escorted by 2 aging torpedo boats used to combat enemy subs, as well as another liner carrying thousands of refugees, the Hansa. But the Hansa and one of the torpedo boats developed last-minute mechanical problems and stayed at dock. As the Gustloff left port, the crew worked furiously to chip ice away from the anti-aircraft guns, the rigging, the davits used to lower the lifeboats, and the deck, which was so coated with ice it looked like a hockey rink. The refugees were packed into the interior like sardines. People sat or slept in holds, closets, stairwells, and hallways. Those who knew about ships tried to find space in the dining room or ballroom. In an emergency, passengers in the upper decks would have an easier time escaping. As the ship grew more crowded, the air became stale and thick. Outside it was frigid. Inside it was hot, damp, and ripe, with the smell of unwashed refugees. Toilets were quickly clogged, and passengers on the edges of the deck grew increasingly nauseous from the pitching of the sea. Without sufficient life jackets for everyone, vests were limited to women and children. However, most passengers removed their life jackets to reduce the discomfort. Around 6 p.m. that evening, the bridge received a message that a convoy of minesweepers was approaching them from the opposite direction. The captains argued about the risk of collision versus the risk of detection. Finally, Zahn won the argument, and Petersen switched on the green and red navigation lights. The Gustloff was lit up like a Christmas tree. At 8 p.m., Hitler delivers a speech commemorating the 12th anniversary of his rise to leader of Germany as head of the Nazi Party. The speech is broadcast live over the ship's public address system, where it receives a frosty reception from many of the refugees. Hitler acknowledges the retreat of the German army from East Prussia, and with it the implication that the Soviets will continue to advance. He calls on all of his countrymen to fight to the death, while promising deserters and cowards will also meet a fate of death, only much less honorable. On the bridge, Zahn and Petersen felt greatly relieved. The Gustloff made it to the shipping channel without hitting any mines, colliding into friendly ships, or being detected by the enemy, and they have agreed on a cruising speed. The captains celebrate with a toast and a round of cognac. Shortly after 9 p.m., the passengers and crew on the upper decks of the Gustloff hear a tremendous thud, followed by the shuddering of the ship. Then come 2 more loud thuds, spaced 2 seconds apart. The ship lurches. Immediately, the Gustloff goes into a 5-degree list to the port side. The S-13 fired all 4 of its torpedoes, scoring direct hits with 3 of them. The fourth torpedo got stuck in the launching tube, fully primed and ready to explode. If not for the quick action of the crew, the torpedo would have detonated and sunk the sub. The first torpedo strikes the front of the Gustloff, creating a huge hole in the port bow. The second torpedo hits further back, exactly in the location of the swimming pool, killing all but 2 of the 373 members of the Women's Navy Auxiliary who were billeted there. The third torpedo strikes the engine room, knocking out all power and communications. Those nearest the explosions are killed instantly. There is panic and hysteria aboard the Gustloff. Passengers receive no directions as to what to do in the case of an emergency. Water rushes into the cabins as women and children scramble around in the darkness. A mad crush of passengers makes their way to the hallways. The staircases are choked with people desperate to escape, and many victims are crushed underfoot in the mayhem. Those still alive are stepping on bodies to ascend the stairs to the outside decks. Captain Zahn later testified that most of the davits were frozen solid and inoperable. He also blamed the many Croatians that made up the crew and spoke no German for getting only 6 of the lifeboats into the water. The captains needed to calm the passengers. An announcement was made over the public address system that the ship had run aground. But when the ship tilted to a 30-degree angle, no one on board believed the announcement. Displaying the selfless courage and heroism of a South Korean ferryboat captain, Zahn used his knowledge of the ship and its safety equipment to get to a lifeboat where he was later rescued. Survivor Rose Rhesus remembers hearing one announcement. "Everyone quiet. We will save the ship." And a minute later came a different announcement. "The ship is sinking. Women with children, go now to the lifeboats." Rose and her sister Ursula were able to make it outdoors to the promenade deck as water continued rushing into the ship. The icy surface was wreaking havoc. Terrified passengers were sliding, rolling, and skidding across the deck, frantically scrambling for lifeboats that were frozen in place. Many people who made it to the top ended up crushed in the panic or slipping into the frigid Baltic waters. Others sat down, succumbing to their fate. "My sister and I were holding hands in the darkness," Rose recalled. "I can't describe the screaming that was going on. A mother sitting next to us said, 'Kids, now it is time to die.'" Crew members shot flares into the sky, hoping a passing friendly ship would spot them. The Gustloff's communication system was dead, but one radio operator was able to use the emergency transmitter, which had just enough juice to get an SOS out to the torpedo boat escort. That boat, the Lowe, was the only vessel to receive a distress call, but the Lowe was able to retransmit the SOS to other ships in the vicinity. After the torpedo hits, Captain Peterson ordered the watertight doors below decks to be closed shut in order to contain the flooding. This led to the unfortunate consequence of drowning most of the Gustloff's crew, including those crew members trained to handle emergency procedures. On the decks above, passengers clawed at the davits to free them without much success. When they did work, often the ropes securing the lifeboats snapped under the weight and the freezing conditions, dumping their occupants into the sea. Those whose lifeboats made it safely into the sea found themselves physically beating back swimmers whose desperation could cause the craft to capsize. Lifeless bodies bobbed up and down in the rolling waters. Life vests designed for adults were pulling children's heads underwater while leaving their legs sticking up in the air. 70 minutes after the torpedo attack, the former glorious symbol of a crumbling empire slipped below the surface of the sea, taking thousands down with it. Just before the Gustloff plunged, all of its lights flickered on in a final blaze. Wailing sirens crackled, then went silent as the ship descended to the ocean floor. The Lowe appeared and was able to rescue 472 of the lucky few who made it to a lifeboat or one of the netted life rafts. 4 more boats arrived to rescue another 643 survivors. 7 hours after the sinking, a patrol boat found the last of the lifeboats. All on board that lifeboat were frozen to death, except for an infant wrapped in a heavy woolen blanket. He was the last official survivor of the Wilhelm Gustloff, and he was adopted by his rescuer. In the confusion, an accurate number of passengers was never calculated. But a team of experts on the Discovery Channel's Unsolved History show concluded that more than 9,000 people died in the sinking of the Gustloff. If the Gustloff had sunk today, the news would have rattled the world. Instead, it happened during our planet's largest and most horrific war. As that war was winding down and atrocities were occurring on a constant basis. The Western Allies were preoccupied with advancing toward Berlin and defeating the Germans. The Soviets were already thinking beyond defeat of the Germans and planning for their position in a post-war world. The Germans were concentrating purely on survival. When Admiral Dönitz received the news of the sinking of the Gustloff, his response was pragmatic. We realized from the start that there would be losses. Painful though these losses were, they represented only 1% of the total brought out by sea. 99% succeeded in arriving safely at ports on the western Baltic. On the other hand, the percentage of refugees lost on the overland route was very much higher. It is a cold but accurate portrayal of conditions at the time. The admiral was in charge of evacuating 2 million civilians through submarine-infested seas and Soviet-controlled skies, in the middle of winter chased by a rapidly approaching enemy who would give no quarter. Operation Hannibal was amazingly successful given the circumstances. Before the operation concluded, 2 more refugee ships would be sunk by Soviet subs. The von Steuben with a loss of life of 4,000 souls, and the MV Goya, a freighter carrying between 7,000 and 8,000 military personnel and civilians, killing all but 180 people. While Hitler was not eager to publicize another stinging defeat during the German retreat, Stalin wasn't anxious to give too much attention to an incident that involved the deaths of so many civilians, mostly women and children. Thus the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff remained under the radar until the end of the Cold War, when survivors and other interested Germans wanted to know exactly what happened. Led by Heinz Schuon, a purser on the Gustloff, extensive research was conducted. The wreckage of the ship was easily located by divers, but they discovered the ship had been tampered with while under sea. Most of the midsection was blown up, and many of the items on board were pilfered. Many experts believe only the Soviets could have allowed or committed such an action, as they had total control of the eastern Baltic during the Cold War. It is difficult to discuss prevention or mitigation of disaster when analyzing the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The events happened in the middle of a terrible war between 2 of the largest combatants ever assembled. The Germans were in full panic mode, and it is easy to see how they did not have sufficient time to take proper precautions. The ship was overloaded with passengers, while tens of thousands of fleeing refugees were left forsaken on the docks of Gotenhafen. Because anti-aircraft guns were mounted to its decks, the Soviets had no reason to believe the Gustloff was a civilian vessel. The ship was on the most dangerous of missions. As Captain Willard said in regards to Vietnam in Apocalypse Now, charging a man with murder in this place was like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. Now it is time for something special. If you're one of those privileged podcast members, you will now get the special bonus segment of this episode of the Podcast of Doom, the famous Amber Room. Did it go down with the Gustloff? If you're not a member, you still have time to become one by making a donation to the Podcast of Doom through our website. Those who are not members will now receive details on how to join. For those of you who are, here is the Podcast of Doom special on the Amber Room. What if I told you that the eighth wonder of the world was buried at the bottom of the Baltic Sea? And would you believe me if I further told you that it went down with the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff? One of the European world's most precious treasures disappeared in the waning days of World War II. That treasure is called the Amber Room, and its story contains more mysteries and twists than the Maltese Falcon. Let's travel back from 1945 to the beginning of the 18th century. Frederick I is the first king of Prussia, But his wife, the queen consort, Sophie Charlotte, and presumably many other well-established kings, are not impressed. So Frederick commissions the building of a great chamber in honor of Sophie, the likes of which has never been seen before. The room will be paneled with the Baltic's most beautiful and precious stone, amber. Although amber is not a stone at all, it is fossilized tree resin. Good amber comes in a variety of glowing colors, from bright gold to blood red. Frederick summoned the great craftsmen of the age, Andreas Schulter for the design, and Gottfried Wolfram for the construction, assisted by a team of experts in the use of amber. The final product, completed in 1711, would be an enormous room in the Charlottenburg Palace covered in 55 square meters of the best amber to be found. It was a mosaic of color, texture, and artistry, and was rumored to convey magical powers to anyone sitting in the room. 5 years later, Frederick's son, Frederick Wilhelm, is the new king, and his fondness for empire building is much greater than his fondness for art. While hosting Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, he takes him on a tour of the Amber Room, now relocated to the Berlin Palace. Peter is completely smitten with the Golden Room. Frederick Wilhelm, without a second thought, offers Peter the whole room in exchange for an alliance. Peter receives the eighth wonder of the world, and Frederick Wilhelm gets a small chunk of Sweden and a buddy for life. Peter moved the entire room to his palace in St. Petersburg, where it would be expanded and refined. Final work was completed in 1760 and restored in 1830. The Amber Room survived the Russian Revolution and became a showpiece of the Soviet government. But Hitler was a big fan of art, particularly of Prussian art. During Operation Barbarossa in 1941, he ordered his art collectors to retrieve the Amber Room. Museum employees in Leningrad, that's the Soviet name for St. Petersburg, fretted over preserving the integrity of the room. Not wanting to chip or break anything, they chose to cover over the panels with wallpaper. That fooled the invading Germans for all of about 3 minutes. They disassembled the entire room, piece by piece, and hauled it off by train to Königsberg for display in that town's castle. As we heard earlier, Königsberg may not have been the safest place to store such a precious art object. By 1944, the Red Army was barreling across Poland with East Prussia in its sights, and the British RAF began its intensive bombing of Königsberg. At this point, the story gets murky. As the original Amber Room disappears from sight, its panels last seen packed into crates for removal. Were the crates destroyed in the bombing of Königsberg? Did the Germans manage to remove it and store it in some safe location underground? Perhaps it was looted and carved up into 1,000 pieces. But the most interesting theory is that the Germans were able to disassemble the room one more time and load it on board a ship to be relocated to a safer place in West Germany. Proponents of that theory say that the Wilhelm Gustloff would have been the most likely ship, and if that were the case, the Amber Room would be buried today at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Or what is left of the Amber Room, as amber is not a stone but an organic material produced by trees. It would not preserve very well in the cold waters of the Baltic. Remember, the divers reported the ship had been heavily pilfered during the Cold War, and the Soviets were the most likely culprits. We can't find the original, but if you would like to see a modern, reconstructed version of the Amber Room, you can view it at the Catherine Palace just outside of St. Petersburg, Russia. Send a postcard if you do. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom, pod@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you and answer any questions that you might have. I would also like to send out a special thanks to listener Rosa Angelone, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Rosa, who just became our newest member. Thank you, Rosa. If you would like to become a Podcast of Doom member, go to the website at www.thepodcastofdoom.com and click on the donate button. The minimum donation for membership is $5, but feel free to contribute what you think is appropriate. Members get access to special episodes and are included in the email distribution. Next time we will explore the earthquake that flattened Lisbon, Portugal, and unsettled philosophers throughout Europe. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.